November sunlight reached Alaska reluctantly. It slid over the wrinkled spine of the Alaska Range, dim and metallic, offering no warmth as it touched the half-finished runway at Big Delta. Frost clung to everything: fuel drums, wooden sleds, the raw edges of newly cut timber, turning the wilderness into a field of glittering glass. And on that brittle morning, the American women who had become the unspoken custodians of the Lend-Lease airbridge were already moving through the cold, as if they had been born inside it. The ALSIB Route was still a guarded secret, but its reality was unmistakable. Hundreds of warplanes, P-39s, A-20s, B-25s, were funneling through this remote outpost on their way to the Soviet front. Every week brought more pilots, more airframes, more accidents, and more emergencies than any northern chain of bases had ever been forced to endure. And in the thin frozen air, the margin between survival and disappearance narrowed with every degree the temperature fell. Wind rolled off the Tanana River in sheets of icy powder, bending the spruce and erasing footprints within minutes. On this frontier, even the simplest task, hauling a cable, clearing a strip, guiding an exhausted pilot toward shelter, required a level of endurance that few in the continental United States would ever understand. Yet the women here carried that weight daily, without insignia, rank, or recognition. They were homesteaders, lodge keepers, trappers' daughters, and former teachers who had learned the land long before the army arrived. When the warplanes came, the terrain became their responsibility. A distant hum drifted over the river valley. At first it was faint, just a vibration hidden beneath the wind. Then it grew. Then it trembled. Then it broke through the cold like a warning. A single Airacobra was descending too fast. Its Allison engine coughed unevenly, flames flickering inside the exhaust stacks before vanishing again. The aircraft was icing, starving for power, falling toward Big Delta, with the helpless glide of a bird that no longer trusted its wings. The pilot fought the controls, but the winter air controlled him. Fuel thickened, hydraulics stiffened, and his canopy glazed over until the world outside was nothing but pale blur and motion. Most bases had ground crews to respond. Big Delta had only a skeleton force, but it had something else, something uniquely American, shaped by the frontier and sharpened by necessity. It had Catherine Cat Hale, and the small band of women who refused to let pilots die on their land. Cat was already running, boots cracking the crusted frost, breath steaming in bursts. Her heavy parka swung behind her as she raced past rows of half-buried crates that held spare parts and emergency fuel caches. Her hands were raw from the morning's work, but she didn't pause to warm them. The Airacobra was sliding sideways now, left wing dipping, the aircraft fighting the wind as it clawed toward the runway. She signaled to the others, Mary with her radio gear, Evelyn with an armful of signal flags, and Nora dragging a sled loaded with tools and blankets. They had no formal title, but to the pilots, they were the guardians of the Tanana Valley. When a plane dropped from the sky, it was these women who reached it first, hour after hour, storm after storm. The Airacobra hit the snow just short of the strip. A spray of ice fanned out behind it, as the nose dug deep, and the tail swung sharply to the side. Cat didn't stop running. She powered through the drift, breath burning in her lungs, knowing from the tilt of the fuselage that the landing gear had collapsed. She reached the canopy, as the engine released a final groan, steam rising around her like ghostly vapor. The pilot struggled with the latch, hands shaking violently. Cat hammered the ice from the frame, cracked the frozen seal, and forced it open with her shoulder. The young man inside was exhausted, and nearly incoherent, but alive. She pulled him free and wrapped him in the thick wool blanket. Nora tossed forward. Snowflakes were already covering the Airacobra's wings. Another aircraft lost, another crew saved. The wind cut harder, but the women stood their ground. This was their war, fought in silence, fought with endurance, fought without medals. Their battlefield was the runway, the frozen river, the endless forest. Their enemy was the cold, and it was relentless. And the pilots who crossed this route would survive only because these American women refused to let the Arctic claim them. Long before the first American Airacobra ever skimmed the treetops of the Tanana Valley, the northern frontier had already forged a reputation as a place where endurance outweighed ambition. Alaska was not designed for war, yet war had carved a path straight through it. The attack on Pearl Harbor severed the illusion of distance, and by early 1942, the United States understood a brutal truth. The Pacific was too vast, the convoy routes too exposed, and the war too urgent to rely solely on ships to supply the Soviet front. A faster, safer artery was needed, one that bypassed submarines, storms, and the wandering expanse of the North Pacific. The result was the ALSIB Airbridge, a chain of secret bases stretching from Montana to Fairbanks and across the Bering Strait. It was a route that demanded thousands of miles of wilderness crossings, hundreds of aircraft per month, and an unbroken sequence of weather reports, landing strips, emergency shelters, and refueling stations. The U.S. Army Air Forces provided the planes, Washington provided the urgency, but Alaska provided something no map could show the people who already knew how to survive there. Long before the Army's first bulldozer arrived, the women who lived along the interior rivers had spent their lives navigating the same terrain that baffled incoming engineers. They understood how snow layered differently on muskeg than on frozen riverbeds, how river ice signaled thickness through sound alone, how winds shifted along the shoulders of the Alaska Range, and how quickly a clear sky could become a whiteout that erased the world. Their knowledge was not textbook. It was inherited, lived, and unforgiving. When the Army began carving runways out of the wilderness, it quickly became clear that official manpower was insufficient. Equipment broke. Crews rotated. Engineers struggled with permafrost that swallowed steel supports and frost heaves that buckled new surfaces overnight. But the frontier women stayed. They remained through every storm, every freeze, every unpredictable shift that redefined the land. They became the continuity that aviation required. Big Delta, later Fort Greely, was the beating heart of this northern chain. Planes from Great Falls and Whitehorse funneled in relentlessly, often damaged, often late, often fighting the very sky that carried them. The base had too few mechanics for the volume of arrivals, and too little infrastructure to support them. In those first months, the Army was fighting the clock. The women were fighting the terrain. And both were racing the Arctic. Kat Hale had lived in the valley since childhood. Her family settled on the edge of the Tanana long before the wartime urgency arrived. She had spent winters trapping, hauling firewood, and surviving storms that outsiders compared to blizzards, but which locals dismissed as ordinary weather. When the Army requested assistance, volunteers, laborers, guides, Kat stepped forward. Not because of patriotism alone, but because she understood exactly how unforgiving the land could be. If pilots were going to survive the ALSIB crossing, someone would have to stand between them and the cold. Around her, an informal corps of frontier women formed. Mary Carson, a former school teacher with a talent for radio equipment. Evelyn Ross, who had operated a local roadhouse and knew every trail within 30 miles. Nora Mallory, who had delivered supplies by dog sled long before the first military truck ever clawed up the valley road. Individually they were capable, together they became indispensable. They scouted frozen clearings for emergency strips, identified tree lines that hid dangerous downdrafts, and marked snowdrifts that swallowed landing gear. When storms trapped pilots for nights at a time, the women provided shelter, heat, food, and just as crucial, guidance on how to read the land that surrounded them. Some pilots arrived shaking uncontrollably, faces burned white by ice and wind, unable to form clear sentences. Others walked from crash sites miles away, exhausted and frostbitten. They survived because the women taught them how. The Army never issued them uniforms. They received no formal titles. Their names appeared in no official dispatches, but their presence shaped every successful crossing. For every P-39 that reached Fairbanks intact, for every A-20 that made it to Nome without incident, a dozen unseen hands had ensured that the pilot never vanished into the frozen wilderness. And as winter deepened, the flow of aircraft increased, more planes, more emergencies, more landings in impossible conditions. The ALSIB route was no longer an experiment. It was a lifeline. And the frontier women had become its silent architects, standing between the Arctic and the warplanes that depended on them. The storm that had nearly claimed the Airacobra was only the beginning. Worse weather was coming. Harder missions were coming, and the land was about to remind everyone that it answered to no one, not even war. The next confrontation with the Arctic arrived without warning. It often did. Even the best aerial forecasts, stitched together from fragments of frontier weather reports, could not keep pace with the atmosphere above Alaska. Storms built silently behind mountain ridges, slid through low valleys, and swept across the sky faster than any pilot could outrun them. When the first white curtain appeared beyond the Tanana River, those at Big Delta felt it in the air before they saw it. Another ferry group was inbound, 4 Airacobras, an A-20 Havoc, and a single C-47 acting as a guide ship. They had departed Whitehorse with clear skies behind them, unaware that the weather ahead had turned hostile within minutes. Ice began forming on the lead P-39 first, then on the A-20. Then across the wings of every aircraft caught inside the descending cloud. By the time they sighted the ground, most were operating on instinct rather than instruments. Kat Hale heard the engines long before the runway crew did. Her ears, trained through years of living along the river, could distinguish the tremble of stress inside an aircraft's engine note. She stepped outside the communications shack and listened. The sound wasn't rhythmic. It stuttered, one aircraft laboring for altitude, another descending too quickly, another compensating for sudden drag as ice thickened across control surfaces. They weren't coming in as a formation, they were scattering. She signaled Mary, who was already adjusting the transmitter, trying to pick out the incoming calls through a storm of static. A few words broke through: losing altitude, engine rough visibility 0. Request emergency approach, icing, control stiff, request bearing. The rest dissolved into distortion. Evelyn stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The snow was approaching in a pale wall, devouring the landscape as it advanced. The faint silhouettes of aircraft appeared and vanished inside the shifting gray. It was not a coordinated landing. It was survival, and each pilot was fighting alone. The first Airacobra dropped out of the turbulence low, far too low. Its landing light flickered through the haze, illuminating the swirling flakes that surrounded it. Kat sprinted toward the runway markers, waving her signal panels in slow, sweeping motions. The pilot, eyes narrowed behind a frost-coated canopy, aligned himself with the barely visible strip. His wheels hit hard, bounced, then touched again, skidding sideways before finding purchase. The aircraft swayed violently before settling. He had made it, though the landing gear groaned in protest, but the others were not as fortunate. The A-20 was next, struggling to maintain balance. Its twin engines shook under uneven thrust, one propeller coughing as ice accumulated along its edges. It approached at an angle no pilot would choose willingly. Kat and Nora braced themselves as the Havoc descended too fast, clipped a mound of snow, and slammed into the far end of the strip. A wing buckled. A faint plume of steam hissed upward as the engines wound down. The aircrew inside moved weakly, but they were alive. A second Airacobra approached with no landing attempt at all. It was gliding, its engine having quit entirely. The pilot had feathered the propeller, relying on the aircraft's remaining altitude to carry him toward the only open land he could see. Kat watched helplessly as the P-39 dipped below the tree line, disappearing behind a stand of black spruce. Moments later, a muffled crunch, the unmistakable sound of a forced landing in deep snow. The C-47 guide ship circled overhead, battling turbulence as it attempted to maintain visual contact with the scattered fighters. The storm swallowed it repeatedly, revealing it only in flashes as it broke through patches of thin cloud. The transport aircraft couldn't risk landing yet, not with visibility collapsing. It remained aloft, buying time for the smaller fighters below. Kat didn't wait for orders. None were needed. She grabbed her sled, loaded with blankets, tools, lanterns, and an emergency stove, and signaled to Evelyn and Nora. The three women pushed into the tree line, following the broken branches and churned snow that marked the Airacobra's descent. The wind roared between the trees, filling the forest with a low, echoing hum that drowned distant sounds. Snow stung their faces, but they pressed on. They found the wreck within minutes. The P-39 lay tilted on its side, its fuselage half buried, its canopy cracked but intact. The pilot was conscious but dazed, struggling to free himself. Kat cleared the snow from the latch and forced the canopy open. She and Nora hauled him out as Evelyn set up a lantern, its warm halo pushing back the storm for a few precious feet. The pilot's first attempt to stand failed. Yvette, the second, succeeded only because Kat held him upright. He didn't need to speak for them to understand the truth. Another minute in the aircraft, and he would have slipped into the cold that killed without mercy. Behind them, the storm swallowed the tree line. More aircraft were still unaccounted for. More pilots were somewhere in the white, and the women of Big Delta would have to find them before the Arctic did. The storm did not ease. It strengthened. Snow thickened until the world dissolved into a shifting blur of white, and the forest seemed to inhale and exhale with every gust of wind. Kat, Evelyn, and Nora moved through it like shadows, guiding the injured pilot toward the sled. Behind them, the forest creaked under the weight of new ice. Above them, the faint growl of the circling C-47 flickered in and out of existence, as though the sky itself were devouring the sound. Back at the runway, Big Delta was reaching a breaking point. The A-20 crew had gathered near the shattered aircraft, huddled against the wind, as Mary dragged out an emergency stove and fought to light it. The match nearly blew out 3 times before a thin flame caught and steadied. Heat, small, fragile but alive, pushed back the cold. It wasn't enough. Another pilot was missing, the last Airacobra of the formation. No radio call, no visual trace, no impact sound. In a storm like this, silence was the most dangerous signal of all. Kat and her team returned with the first rescued pilot, breath ragged, faces burning from exposure. Even their heavy parkas looked thin against the storm. She helped the pilot into the makeshift shelter, but her eyes were already on the tree line again. The missing aircraft had not gone down near the others. It had vanished deeper, into terrain where the land itself became a maze of ridges, drifts, and frozen riverbeds. Mary checked the radio again, but static overwhelmed every frequency. The wind shook the shack walls. The green radio lamp flickered as if straining to stay alive. When Kat stepped inside for a brief moment of shelter, Mary met her eyes with the quiet understanding shared by people who had lived long under the same sky. If they didn't go now, the pilot would die. If they went now, they might not return. Kat didn't hesitate. She tightened her scarf, strapped snowshoes to her boots, packed a second lantern, and nodded to Evelyn and Nora. The 3 women moved out once more, the storm swallowing them whole. They didn't know exactly where the third Airacobra had fallen, but they understood the land in ways no map could explain. Winds changed direction when crossing the river. Snow drifted deeper near the base of certain ridges. Trees leaned differently, where the ground dipped into muskeg. The patterns were invisible to outsiders, but the frontier had taught them to read its signs. They searched ridge by ridge, pausing only to listen. Snow muffled everything. Sound became a distant, muted echo. But then, faintly, a metallic groan reached them. Not wind, not branches, something heavier, something man-made. They moved toward it. 100 yards ahead, barely visible between bent spruce and swirling snow, lay the wreck. The P-39 had plowed nose first into a bank, its propeller buried deep, one wing torn at the root. Steam hissed from the fractured cowling, though the engine was dead. The canopy was half open, jammed by ice, and inside, the pilot had slumped sideways, movement slow and weak. Kat waded forward, snow reaching her thighs. She scraped ice from the canopy frame, tapped it with the back of her axe, and forced the latch open. Nora climbed onto the tilted fuselage to help. Evelyn lit the lantern, and held it high, its heat preventing the canopy from freezing shut again. Together they pulled the pilot free, his face wind-burned, his breath shallow, his fingers stiffening from cold that crept beneath his gloves. He whispered something, but the wind stole the words before they reached anyone's ears. The journey back was slower. The wind had deepened the drifts, and the pilot drifted in and out of consciousness. Twice they nearly lost the sled to sudden gusts that pushed it sideways. Once Kat had to stop completely, when the storm surged in a white torrent that erased the ground beneath her feet. In that moment, even she wondered whether the land had finally claimed the route that the army believed could be tamed. But then the faint glow of lanterns appeared, shimmering, blurred. But there, Big Delta's shelter. Mary and the others had kept the lights burning through the storm, a beacon in the wilderness. The women pushed the sled the final 100 yards until they reached the edge of the runway. Soldiers rushed forward to help, their faces stunned at the sight. 3 civilian women, half frozen, hauling a downed pilot out of a storm that had grounded an entire airlift. Inside the shelter, one of the crewmen whispered the truth that everyone understood but rarely voiced aloud. Without them, we'd be burying half the route. Outside the storm roared, but the battle, at least for now, had been won. When dawn finally broke, it arrived quietly. No brilliance, no warmth, just a slow lifting of the gray curtain that had hung over Big Delta through the night. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind deep drifts that swallowed the lower branches of spruce trees and reshaped the familiar contours of the land. Smoke curled from the shelters where the rescued pilots slept, recovering from injuries and cold that could easily have ended differently. The C-47 guide ship, grounded throughout the night, touched down at first light. Its wheels carved 2 clean paths through untouched snow as it rolled to a stop. The crew stepped out, expecting a field of casualties, a line of wrecks, a tally of dead. Instead, they found aircraft damaged but intact, crews shaken but alive, and the base functioning with a calm efficiency that defied the violence of the storm. And at the center of it all, quietly, without ceremony, stood Cat Hale and the women who had carried the weight of the night on their shoulders. The army officers gathered reports, counted aircraft, calculated losses. They noted damage to the A-20, the position of the 2 crashed Airacobras, the recovery of all personnel. What they did not fully record but could not ignore was the truth that every pilot understood survival along the ALSIB route depended as much on these frontier women as on fuel, engines, or training. Throughout the morning, pilots emerged from the shelter one by one. Some wore bandages on their hands and faces, others limped, others spoke little. Cold sapped both energy and language, but when they looked toward Kat and the others, their expressions carried the weight of gratitude rarely spoken aloud. These were men trained for combat in distant skies, yet it was the frozen wilderness of Alaska, not enemy fighters, that had nearly claimed them. And it was the women of Big Delta who had fought back against the land itself to bring them home. As the day turned, the army resumed its routine: repair aircraft, refuel, prepare for the next departure. The ALSIB route never paused, never rested. Every hour lost in Alaska meant delays across the Atlantic, across the Arctic, across the front lines where Soviet troops were waiting for the aircraft that originated here. Engineers assessed the runway and declared it serviceable. Mechanics worked on the grounded A-20, heat lamps melting the frost that clung stubbornly to its control surfaces. The wrecked Airacobras would be salvaged later. For now they remained half-submerged in snow, their twisted frames standing as markers of the previous night's battle. But the most enduring mark of the storm lay not in metal or ice, but in recognition. Quietly, among the pilots and officers who had witnessed it firsthand, a truth spread, one that the Army's paperwork would only hint at: no part of the Lend-Lease airbridge worked without the frontier women. Their role was not supplemental, it was structural. Their presence made the route viable, turning the deadliest stretch of wilderness into a corridor that could support hundreds of aircraft deliveries. Without them, crashes would have multiplied. Rescue missions would have failed. Winter would have devoured crews faster than reinforcements could replace them. In the weeks that followed, stories traveled down the line, reports of women who hauled wounded pilots on sleds, who repaired equipment in temperatures that froze tools to skin, who maintained shelters when supply lines faltered, who guided engineers through land they could not read themselves. Pilots spoke of Big Delta as if it were a fortress held not by soldiers, but by endurance itself. The legacy extended far beyond Alaska. Every aircraft that reached Fairbanks, crossed the Bering Strait, and entered Soviet hands carried a hidden signature, an imprint of the frontier women, who had kept it alive during the most treacherous leg of its journey. Their contributions were rarely documented in official histories, yet the effect rippled across entire fronts. Soviet pilots flew American aircraft whose survival had depended on efforts thousands of miles away, in a wilderness few would ever see. By spring, the Arctic days lengthened again. Snow retreated, rivers cracked open, and flights increased. But the memory of that storm, the night when 3 women went into the wilderness and brought back every missing pilot, became part of the unrecorded history of the ALSIB Route. It lived in the recollections of the airmen who almost died there, and in the quiet pride of the women who returned to their tasks the next morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The war would move on. The route would change. New bases would rise. But the heart of the Northern Airbridge had already been defined, not by steel or command structures, but by the Americans who stood between the Arctic and the warplanes that depended on them. And in the end, when the numbers were counted and the aircraft tallied, the truth was simple. The ALSIB Route survived because its frontier women refused to let it fail.